My name is Denise Ashworth. I'm 36 years old. And last Thanksgiving, my father stood up at the head of the table, raised his glass, and told me I was getting nothing. Around me, my family clapped. Actually clapped, while he announced he was selling our 3-generation building supply business for $58 million. Then he said the buyer's name out loud, proud as a rooster, rolling it around his mouth like good bourbon. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap because I was the only person at that table who knew whose signature was on the other side of that deal. Everyone in my family remembers what I said next. It's become the story they tell in 2 counties. But here's what none of them knows. The part that mattered didn't happen at Thanksgiving. It happened 26 days later, in a room with no turkey, 3 lawyers, and a single folded piece of paper I slid across a table. What that piece of paper cost me is the real story. Welcome back to Quiet Fire Stories, where quiet people finally tell the stories their families hoped would stay buried. If you've ever been written off at your own family's table, passed over, talked over, told to go help in the kitchen, this one's for you. Drop a comment below, and be sure to subscribe. To picture what $58 million was actually buying, you have to see a hardware store in Cedarville, Georgia. In 1997, through the eyes of a 6-year-old sitting on the counter. Ashworth Building Supply. My grandfather Otis opened the first store on Main Street in 1961 with a loan he paid off in nickels. By the time I came along, there were 6 stores in a lumberyard, and the whole town smelled faintly of sawdust because of us. I grew up behind that counter. I counted washers into paper bags before I could read. I learned margins before long division because Grandpa Otis taught math with a price gun. When the register came up short, it was me he handed the tape to, age 9, because in his words, Denise finds it. She always finds it. He taught me to read a spirit level that same year, holding his old aluminum one steady on the workbench, a $9 tool he'd bought in 1961 and trusted more than most men. You watch the bubble, he said. People will tell you a shelf is straight, a deal is fair, a man is honest. The bubble never lies. I loved that store the way other girls loved horses. I knew every aisle, every vendor rep's coffee order, every squeak in the floor by the paint counter. By 9, I could balance the register on the first pass. It took me 27 more years to learn what I could never balance, no matter how many times I ran the tape. And it wasn't in the drawer. It was standing at the end of the counter, in a canvas work apron, teaching my brother to drive the forklift with his back to me. Nobody in my family ever said out loud that the store would go to my brother. They didn't have to. It was said in 100 quieter ways. When Marcus turned 12, Dad took him on delivery runs to learn the routes. When I turned 12, Dad told me I was getting good at keeping things nice and sent me upstairs to help Mom with the church rummage boxes. Marcus got a name tag. I got a compliment. Marcus broke the pallet jack, and it was part of learning. I reorganized the entire fastener aisle by thread size one summer, and Dad walked through it, nodded once, and asked Marcus if he'd eaten. There was a schedule board in the back of the warehouse. Every employee's name down the side, full-timers, part-timers, the high school kid who swept Saturdays. Everyone who belonged to the store was on that board. In 20 years, through every summer I worked there for free, my name was never written on it. Not once. I used to stand in the warehouse and look at that grid the way other people look at family photos they're not in. I want to be fair, because fair matters to me. My father was never cruel. He never mocked me, never raised his voice, never once made me cry at that counter. He did something quieter, and I'd argue more expensive. He exempted me from the work, from the weight, from the will, from all of it. Like a tax I was too pretty to pay. He genuinely believed that was love. It would take me almost 30 years in a lawyer's conference room in December to understand what it actually was. The year I turned 25, the store started dying. A Home Depot went up 20 minutes away, and our parking lot thinned out month by month like a hairline. Dad's answer was to work harder at the same things. Open earlier, sweep cleaner, trust the loyalty of contractors who were already quietly opening accounts at the big box. I had just finished my MBA at night, 3 years of classes after full days doing the store's books, unpaid and unlisted, like a ghost with a calculator. And I did the thing hopeful daughters do. I wrote a plan. 31 pages. Shift the business from walk-in retail to contractor delivery. Sign builders onto subscription accounts. Put inventory on actual software instead of Marcus's memory. Use the lumberyard as a distribution hub for 3 counties. I printed it at the library, bound it with a black spine, and put it on my father's desk on a Tuesday in April, and stood there while he read it, the way you stand for a verdict. He read 3 pages, maybe 4. Then he squared the edges, set it down, and looked at me with something close to kindness, which is the part I've never forgiven, and said, "Hardware isn't for girls, Denise." Then he asked if I could run lunch out to Marcus at the yard. Within a year, I was gone. Atlanta, 90 minutes and 1 entire universe down the interstate. The plan stayed behind on his desk. Hold that thought. It comes back. I moved to Atlanta with $9,500 in savings, a laptop with a cracked lid, and a theory. If my father wouldn't run his supply chain on software, other men's fathers might. I named the company Summit Holdings. The name wasn't ambition. It came from a night in the store when Grandpa Otis looked at a misstacked delivery towering by the dock and said, "Somebody's got to climb that mountain, and it's always us." Summit builds inventory and delivery software for building suppliers and contractors. In other words, I sold my father's rejected 31 pages, 1 feature at a time, to every hardware man in the Southeast except him. The first year, I made almost nothing and slept in the office twice a week. By year 5, we'd passed 100 employees. Last year, we were in 900 supply houses across 26 states. I still drove an 8-year-old truck because money was never the point, and spending it felt like admitting something. Here's the part I'm less proud of. I built that company like a fortress. No partners with real power, no mentors, nobody close enough to tell me no. My chief financial officer once said, not unkindly, that I ran Summit like a woman who'd been robbed once and now slept on top of the safe. I told him that was ridiculous, then went home to a house I'd bought alone, ate dinner alone, and reviewed the quarter alone, feeling perfectly safe and perfectly certain that needing people was a weakness I'd been smart to cut out early. If nobody's allowed to help you, nobody gets to refuse you. That was my arithmetic for 9 years. It added up beautifully, right up until the teaser landed in our deals inbox. You should know what my family and I were to each other by then, because it wasn't estrangement exactly. It was something politer and sadder. My mother, Carolyn, called every Sunday at 4, and we talked about her tomatoes and my weather, never the store, by unspoken treaty. I drove up to Cedarville twice a year, Easter and Thanksgiving, and sat at the far end of the table like a well-dressed roomer. Marcus was vice president of operations by then, a title Dad invented for him. His wife Renee had a gift for compliments with a hook in them. "Look at you, Denise, still so busy. Some people bring casseroles, and some people bring ambition." I brought pie and said little. What I noticed those visits was the store bleeding. The empty end caps, the vendor reps who'd stopped coming, 2 registers dark on a Saturday. Then one Sunday in August, in the middle of the tomato report, my mother lowered her voice like the kitchen had ears. "Your dad met some men in suits on Tuesday, at the store, after close. He wore his funeral jacket in Cedarville after close." I said something soothing and got off the phone and sat very still. My mother thought it was bankers and feared it. I ran a software company that served over 300 supply houses in Georgia alone, and I knew the difference between bankers and brokers. Somebody wasn't borrowing money to save the store. Somebody was measuring it for a casket. The teaser arrived in Summit's acquisitions inbox on a Thursday in September, an anonymous 2-page summary sent to likely buyers. Codename Project Timber. Regional building supply chain, 6 retail locations plus lumberyard, roughly $79 million in annual revenue, 220 employees, founder-owned, motivated seller. Strategic buyers in vertical software were on the list, which is how it came to us. I read 2 lines and knew every squeak in its floors. My head of acquisitions, Terrence, walked in with the same pages. "This one's in your backyard, boss. Worth a look." I heard myself say in a voice I didn't fully recognize, "Yes, but I stay off the calls." I told Terrence it was standard practice. Anonymity keeps negotiations clean. That's true, but that's not why I did it. I hid my name because a hidden name can't be handed back. If my father knew who was reaching for the store, he could do to the offer what he did to the 31 pages. Square its edges, set it down, send it out for sandwiches. Anonymous, I couldn't be refused. So Summit signed the NDA, bid through a shell called Acquisition LLC, and somewhere in Cedarville, my father started telling my mother things were finally turning around. Neither of them had any idea. We weren't the only bidder, but we were the only serious one. In mid-November, the letter of intent was signed. Non-binding, but signed. My father shook Terrence's hand across a conference table and told him afterward, "Tell your people they're buying the best-run yard in Georgia." That night, my mother called off schedule. "You're coming for Thanksgiving. Your dad has news." "Good news, honey." I said yes. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time, turning over the strangest, most human thought I'd had in 9 years. He sounds proud. I wonder who he thinks he's proud of. Before I walk you into that dining room, if you've ever sat at a table where your chair was a courtesy, where you were family in the photos but staff in the decisions, tell me in the comments where you were sitting when you figured it out. And subscribe, because what my father announced over the turkey is only the third most shocking thing that happens in this story. Thanksgiving. My parents' house in Cedarville. The good tablecloth. 11 people. My father wore a collared shirt at his own table and kept touching his water glass without drinking. Marcus arrived loud, in a new coat. Renee appraised my dress like an insurance adjuster and called it brave. I'd known this was coming for 11 days, ever since a signature page crossed my desk with my father's name on it, above the line, "Seller," in the blue fountain ink he'd used my whole life. My father stood between the turkey and the pie and tapped his glass. "Family, I have an announcement. I've made a decision about the business. We're selling. It's done. $58 million. The number landed on that table like a flock of birds. Marcus was on his feet before the echo died, whooping. My mother said, "Frank," in a small voice, and got no further, because my father wasn't finished. He turned to me. "Denise, I want to say this plain in front of everybody, so there's no lawyers and no whispering later. The proceeds go to the people who built this business. Your brother put in the years. You left." He paused. The pause was worse than the sentence. "You're getting nothing." Marcus clapped. Renee lifted her glass. My mother's spoon slipped from her fingers and rang against her plate, and nobody picked it up. I unfolded my napkin, smoothed it flat, and asked my question. "Dad, who's the buyer?" It was the one question nobody had thought to ask. My father straightened. "Outfit out of Atlanta, software people, if you can believe it. Summit Holdings. They're paying $58 million. Then, savoring it, they know a well-run operation when they see one." Around the table, the name meant nothing to anyone but me. I had 90 seconds, maybe less, to choose between the plan. Smile, say congratulations, tell them in January through lawyers, and the truth. My father raised his glass. "To the buyer, whoever they are." "Dad," I said into the toast, "I am Summit Holdings." The silence that follows a sentence like that has a specific quality, the silence of a room recalculating. Marcus laughed first, one bark. "Good one. When?" I kept my eyes on my father, frozen mid-toast, and said it again, slower. "Summit Holdings is my company, Dad. I founded it 9 years ago. I own it. Acquisition. That's my signature. Your broker's been carrying to Atlanta." Renee had her phone out, thumbs blurring, and found the site. The founder bio page we'd always kept deliberately gray. "Founder and chairman, Diaz." She turned the phone toward Marcus, whose face did something complicated. Disbelief, then belief, then math. My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father lowered his glass 1 inch at a time and said the sentence I'll be quoting to therapists for the rest of my life. "Not how, not when, not why. Didn't you tell me? Is this a joke you bought?" As if the only way I could hold something this size was as a prank. Nobody ate the pie. My father left his own table before the coffee and the front door clicked, and the porch light stayed off. I found him the next morning at the store, under the old fluorescents, standing at Grandpa Otis's workbench, coffee gone cold. He reached into the sticking drawer and took out my grandfather's spirit level, dented the window honeycombed with age, and held it out flat on both palms. "Your grandfather paid $9 for this in 1961. Everything square in this building got squared with it." I reached for it. He drew it back. Not sharply, gently, which was worse. I'm showing you, he said, not giving. He slid the drawer shut. 58 million, and you couldn't come to me with your own name. He wasn't entirely wrong. He'd refused my name for 25 years. I'd stopped offering it. Monday morning, my father called his broker and told him to find another buyer. My father would rather take less money from strangers. The strangers had a name, Cornerstone Partners, out of Chicago, a liquidation firm. Their offer, $52 million, $6 million less than mine. Their plan, sell the real estate under 4 of the 6 stores, close them, keep the lumberyard and delivery contracts, and right-size the workforce. 220 employees. I'd grown up underfoot of half of them. Miss Delacroix at the paint counter, who kept butterscotch in her smock for me before I could see over it. Ray in the yard for 26 years, who taught Marcus the forklift and taught me too, quietly after close because I asked and Marcus didn't. Under Cornerstone's math, most of them had 18 months. My father was willing to sign it because the alternative was endorsing a check with his daughter's name on it. He'd rather it die in a stranger's hands than live in his daughter's. I taped Miss Delacroix's butterscotch wrapper to the corner of my monitor and told Terrence we weren't withdrawing. In the first week of December, our due diligence team found the hole. $4.6 million in past due supplier debt, appearing nowhere in the seller's financials. Invoices shuffled between entities. Quiet credit extensions signed with my brother's name at the bottom from 2 years back when Dad's eyes went bad and handed Marcus the books. It wasn't embezzlement. It was a drowning man hiding the water. Every quarter the store sank deeper, and every quarter Marcus told Dad the yard was turning around and moved the hole 1 column over. My father was selling a company he believed was worth $58 million, and it provably wasn't, and he had no idea, because the son he'd given the books to had been redecorating them. I sat with that folder alone in my office. Disclosed, it would detonate both deals. Cornerstone would slash or sue. My father would learn his heir had cooked the family books. Marcus could face fraud claims from 2 directions. Read out loud in the right room. That folder would hand me the store at a crawlspace price and hand my father a humiliation so total he'd never grade another paper of mine again. Leverage. Real, documented leverage. The exact currency my family had traded in my whole life. Quick pause, 'cause I want this on your conscience too. That folder is still in my safe. Before you find out what I did with it, tell me in the comments what you would have done. Read it to the room, or slide it across the table. Your answer says more about your family than mine. And subscribe if you haven't, because the next stretch of this story cost me more than the $58 million. The folder wasn't my only problem. Summit is mine, but $16 million of the deal money came from a growth fund that had backed us for years. Patient money, and professional money reads due diligence reports. The Monday after our findings hit the data room, the fund called a meeting, 1 agenda item, delivered by a man named Whitfield. We're not paying $58 for a company with a $4.6 million hole. Their terms for staying in, cut the offer to $44 million and commit to closing 3 of the 6 stores, Main Street first. I looked at their term sheet and, for a second, almost admired it. It was Cornerstone's plan wearing our logo. Same surgery, better bedside manner. And that's when I understood the shape of the trap. I'd built myself into a corner where every rational path to owning my family's store ran through gutting it, doing to Miss Delacroix and Ray exactly what I was spending $58 million to prevent. Win like a buyer, lose the store. Walk like a daughter, lose it too. I told Whitfield I'd consider it, a lie delivered in fluent chairman, and drove home with his term sheet on the passenger seat like a hitchhiker I regretted picking up. I called Whitfield back Wednesday and declined. Then we're out, Whitfield. This is a rescue, not a deal, and we don't fund rescues. By Friday, the paperwork was signed and $16 million stood up from my table and put on its coat. Terrence asked in the empty conference room, "Do we walk?" And I told him the truth for the first time in the entire transaction, about the counter, the register tape, the schedule board, a 31-page plan, and a spirit level in a stuck drawer. He listened all the way through. You know this deal stopped making sense 2 weeks ago? It stopped being a deal the day he said I built none of it. I said. Which wasn't an answer. It was a diagnosis. I answered a small question instead of the big one. Could the deal still close without the fund? Yes, if I bet the fortress. Which brings us to December 10th, and the worst signature of my life. Almost the worst. Second worst. On December 8th, my assistant buzzed to say a Marcus Ashworth was in the lobby. No appointment. My brother had never once in 9 years come to Atlanta. He looked wrong in my building. Too big for the chair, coat still on, doing inventory of the place with his eyes like a man pricing what his sister's life must have cost. He closed the door, sat down, and negotiated. He knew about the $4.6 million. Of course he did. His offer, stripped of 40 minutes of sweating and family loyalty speeches. He keeps quiet, and in exchange he works on Dad, gets him to drop Cornerstone and let me buy the store. I can deliver him, he said, recovering a little swagger. He listens to me. That's worth something, right? My brother selling me our father's ear, priced in silence. Watching him, I felt not rage, recognition. He was drowning exactly the way the store was drowning, quietly, respectably, moving the whole one column over, because he'd been handed a thing he never earned by a man who confused handing with love. I said no, both halves. No to the silence, and no for now to exposing him. Then what do you want? He asked, and for once he sounded 9 years old too. For it to end clean, I said. One of us has to stop playing the family game. Watch me. On December 10th, in Ruth Calloway's office, I signed a personal guarantee. To replace the fund's $16 million, I borrowed against everything actually mine. My controlling shares in Summit and the house in Atlanta, the first thing I'd ever bought that no one could take back. If the deal closed and the store recovered, fine. If it didn't, the bank owned my fortress. Both meanings. Ruth made me read every page aloud. Halfway through, my phone lit up. Mom? I let it ring out, kept reading, signed. I called her back from the parking garage, engine off. She was crying before she finished a sentence. Your father hasn't slept since Thanksgiving. He keeps saying he'd rather bury that store than hand it over. Bury it to his own daughter. Who says that? A man following his level, I didn't say. A man squaring a shelf with the only tool he was ever given. 3 days before closing, both bidding teams were invited to a final walkthrough at the flagship store. I went in person. My father didn't look at me once. I stood in aisle 5 of my childhood while a young Cornerstone associate named Braden walked my father through their value realization roadmap, out loud, in the store with staff pretending not to hear. He aimed a laser pointer at the ceiling Otis Ashworth paid off in nickels and called the Main Street location a natural first divestment. He said the workforce carried meaningful redundancy. In front of Miss Delacroix, who is not redundant, who is load-bearing, who kept butterscotch in her smock for a lonely kid 30 years ago. I watched my father's jaw move at the laser dot on Otis's ceiling, his hand find the edge of a shelf to confirm it was still there. He was hearing, in the flesh, what strangers actually meant. His pride stood there and took it, because in his arithmetic, even this beat the alternative. He shook Braden's hand. On my way out, Miss Delacroix pressed 2 butterscotches into my palm without a word. Whatever room I walked into 3 days later, I was going to be carrying those. The night before closing, I laid it all out on my kitchen table. Left side, the Summit purchase agreement, flagged where signatures went. Right side, Cornerstone's term sheet, the one my father was scheduled to sign at 2 p.m. if our 10 a.m. came to nothing. In the middle, the folder. $4.6 million of my brother's quiet drowning, tabbed and highlighted. I rehearsed reading it out loud. Standing at my counter at 1 a.m., I practiced. Gentlemen, before anyone signs anything, you should know what the seller's own numbers are hiding. In the rehearsal, I watched Cornerstone's lawyers pack their bags. Then I watched my father's face cave in. Watched Marcus's name come apart in front of the men whose respect he'd inflated himself for. Total victory. I had it memorized in 2 passes. Then I thought about the drawer that sticks. My whole family ran on exactly this fuel. Things known and not said, spent at the moment of maximum damage. Dad hiding the sale until he could unveil it. Marcus hiding the whole. Me hiding my name inside an LLC. 3 generations who would rather hold a secret than hold each other, and every one of us calling it strength. If I read that folder to the room, I'd win the store by being the best Ashworth in history at the family sport. There are two ways to walk into a room holding a bomb. I chose the one my grandfather would have recognized. December 19th, 10 a.m. The long conference room at Whitmore and Katz in Cedarville. Frost on the parking lot. My father in his funeral jacket, Marcus gray as drywall mud. My father opened by not opening. I'm here as a courtesy. Cornerstone signs at 2. I'm told it's proper to hear the standing offer first. He was going to sit through my $58 million offer for Manners, then drive across town and sell his father's name to a laser pointer, $4 million cheaper, out of spite, dressed up as principal. Ruth reached for the purchase agreement. I put my hand flat on it. Not yet. I took out a single sheet of paper, folded once, Melanie's summary, totals, and signature dates, no exhibits, no theater. The full folder stayed in my bag. It never came out. It never will. I slid the folded page across the table and stopped it in front of my father. Read it, just you. Marcus made a small sound, the sound a man makes when the elevator drops an inch. My father read, and I watched 3 bad years and 1 terrible son land on him line by line. His hand came up slowly and covered his mouth. What is that? Marcus said, too fast. Dad, what did she give you? And that's when my brother broke, standing up, chair squealing, pouring it out in front of both sets of lawyers. The extensions. The shuffled invoices. Pitched first as strategy, then as sacrifice, then as the thing it actually was. You gave me the books and a dying store and Home Depot, and I was handling it. What was I supposed to say? That I couldn't. You left. You gotta leave. I stayed and drowned in it, and everyone clapped for me while I went down. The room held perfectly still. 3 lawyers studying their legal pads with tremendous professional interest. My brother sat back down in pieces. I said nothing the entire time. The truth had finally stood up at an Ashworth table, and introduced itself, and for once none of us had hidden it in a drawer. My father folded the page back along my crease and asked what I wanted. Here's what I could have said. With that page face up, and Cornerstone 2 hours out, I could have recut my offer to $40 million, and he'd have taken it. I could have demanded the public apology. I had him square in the one position he'd never allowed me, needing my next sentence. 25 years of arithmetic, ready to settle in my favor. And standing in all that leverage, I finally saw it for what it was, the family sport, championship round, and me with the best secret at the table. My grandfather's bubble sat dead center, so here's what I actually said, level the whole way through. Here's my last offer, Dad. Same deal. $58 million. Same number I offered when I thought the books were clean. I know about the hole now, and I'm paying anyway, because the name on that sign is worth more to me than the truth is worth as a weapon. I laid out 2 conditions. Every one of the 220 employees keeps their job for a minimum of 3 years, in writing in the agreement, and the name stays on the sign. Ashworth, not Summit. Then I gave him the honest ledger. The fund was gone, the shortfall was mine, borrowed against my shares and my house. No cushion, no board above me. You'd be selling to your daughter and everything she owns. That's the whole offer. It doesn't get better at 2. It just gets 4 million smaller and 220 people meaner. My father listened with his hands still on that folded page. Why? Not even a question mark. You told me I was getting nothing, I said. You were right. Nothing is what I built with. Turns out it's enough if you start early. My father took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. I sat where you're sitting once, he said, older than I'd ever heard him. 1988. Otis had a buyer for the yard. Real money. I talked him out of it in this same firm because I couldn't stand for it to go to strangers. I just didn't have the money to buy my way out of his opinion. You did. That's the whole difference between us. 1 generation of money. It's the closest thing to an apology I've ever received from him, and it wasn't one. I've decided it doesn't matter. He put his glasses back on, asked his lawyer 2 good questions about the employment guarantee and the name covenant, and then my father, 61 years old, second of his line, wrong about me for exactly as long as I'd been alive, picked up the pen and signed the Summit agreement like a man setting down something heavy at the end of a long carry. No speech, no tears. Cornerstone's 2 hout evaporated somewhere over the parking lot. As the room stood and reached for the untouched coffee, my father reached into the pocket of his funeral jacket and took out Otis's spirit level and slid it across the table to me, dented end first, without a word. I put my hand over it. The aluminum was warm from being carried against his chest, and neither of us said anything at all. It was the most either of us had ever said. It's April now. The sign over Main Street says Ashworth Building Supply. Fresh paint. Same name, that was in the contract, but I'd have done it anyway. We run the delivery and subscription model out of the lumberyard, the 31-page plan with 9 years of software behind it, and March was the first month in 4 years the company didn't lose money. In this town, that's a parade. The schedule board in the back has everybody's name on it now, including, in the top corner, in my own handwriting. Mine. 26 years late. Still counts. Marcus resigned the week after closing. We didn't prosecute and we didn't announce. The debt was disclosed to the bank, restructured, and is being paid down, his part of it in installments on paper with his signature, C, which Ruth insisted on, and which I think was the first honest arithmetic of his adult life. My mother calls on Sundays and talks about tomatoes and about my father, who has developed at 61 a habit nobody assigned him. He shows up Saturday mornings, quietly squares the store, fixes a hinge, walks the floor with his coffee. We don't discuss the deal. We discuss inventory. Last Saturday, he stood watching the loading dock and said, Otis would have liked the trucks. I said, he'd have hated the software. My father laughed. One short, rusty sound like a drawer coming unstuck. I keep the level on my desk in the Cedarville office, bubbled dead center. Here's the one thing I know now that I didn't know at that Thanksgiving table. I spent 9 years building a company that was really a 9-year application for my father's approval. And the first paper I ever signed for myself was the one everybody in the room said would ruin me. That's my story. One Thanksgiving toast. One folder I never read out loud. One $9 level that finally came home. If someone at your table has been auditioning for love that should have been free, send them this video, and then stop rehearsing. You're already enough. If you were sitting where I was that night, would you have read that folder out loud, or slid it across the table the way I did? Drop a comment telling me what you'd have done, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.